although we're so technologically advanced as modern men and women, we've become detached from something that people would have felt normal. You know, like past tribes, people like that are still so in touch with nature. We seem to have grown apart somehow.
Short answer, yes. And I think it all happened really quite recently. You can think about the period of time sometimes called the Enlightenment, or the beginning of ideas that we might think of as modern ideas, modern paradigms, ways of life, modern metaphysics, theories of reality, which are quite unlike even medieval theories of everything, of medieval metaphysics, which was much more animistic, much more of a sense of nature being alive, the universe being alive, and us being living organisms as participating in a living universe. As opposed to the post-Enlightenment view, which is that the universe is dead, and somehow out of this bleak assortment of deadness arises us, this glimmer of consciousness. And then we struggle in this lonely universe to try and make sense of ourselves. It's very narcissistic, and it's led us into all sorts of problems. So I think in some sense, yes, the psychedelic experience can take us back to an older way of knowing, an older way of perceiving. Certainly in my own experiences with psychedelics, I have a sense that my mind is very much bigger than I realized it was. It's as if I spent most of my days in the garden, the little prim garden, little garden of my house. And then when taking psychedelics, I realized that actually, my mind is, it's not just this little garden. There's a gate at the end of the garden. I can go down this path and into the woods, and they turn into forests and heathlands and moorlands. And this is all part of my mind. I just don't spend much time in these more wilder parts of my mind. And when thought about like that, it becomes clear that, well, if my mind is so much bigger than I thought, then where does it stop being mine? Because lots of other organisms must have bigger minds than them. And then all these minds must overlap with each other. And so I'm led very quickly to a sense of mindedness, a sort of ensouled universe, in a strongly felt intuitive way on psychedelics. And I think this is much more congruent with a pre-modern way of thinking, a traditional way of thinking and knowing.
I don't know if you know much, I read a little bit in your book about animal agriculture and kind of environmental kind of footprint that it has. Do you see if mushrooms were made more, like culinary versions of mushrooms were more readily available, if there was more variety, do you think it could start to offset that a bit because of their availability, how quickly they can be grown?
For sure, yeah. I mean, there's people making all sorts of meat substitutes using mycelium, which corn is a good example. Yeah. Been around for some time, ahead of the curve. And but these mycelial meat substitutes have a lot of potential because you can grow them really quickly in vats.
Yeah, not so much water, I guess.
Not so much water. You don't have to cut down the forest. You don't have to torture all the animals. And so, yeah, and there's a huge amount of potential. Likewise for the fungal building materials, or fungal leather-like materials, which you can use. You can harness waste streams, sawdust and corn stalks.
I saw this recently. They can grow sheets of leather in, almost weeks.
In weeks, in 4 weeks. Yeah.
Cows
Exactly, no cows needed. And you're using all of this stuff that would otherwise just be left to rot outside. And so there's a wonderful sense in doing so that we are learning something from fungi by thinking in more cyclical terms, and learning to reimagine waste as something which is then useful for something else, which is how it always works in the living world. We have these funny ideas of waste streams as sort of straight lines, starting with product and ending with landfill, like a kind of terminus, a dreary terminus. But if we think more in terms of cycles, then we can do all sorts of wonderful things.
I watched Paul Stamets talking about using mycelium to kind of clean up oil spills. I don't know if you've seen that. I think it was a TED talk possibly. And so you would introduce mycelium to the oil spill. They did a test on land, and it could soak up the oil. Within 6 weeks, it was fruiting sort of healthy mushrooms. And then those mushrooms got spores that would attract kind of insects and larvae, which would attract birds. The birds pooped out seeds, and then, within months you've got greenery, hardly any oil left, and it's attracting other kind of living things to the area. Another thing he was doing was creating almost sandbags of mycelium that you could put downstream from kind of farms, from factories, and use them to build a kind of filtering system for all that harmful stuff that's coming out. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting kind of things coming out of it.
Well, there's so much potential because fungi are metabolically ingenious, and they've been metabolically ingenious for over 1 billion years. And there's lots of ways that humans already have partnered with fungi to outsource our metabolisms to these organisms who are just far more capable than us at transforming one thing into another. And it's a long, wonderful, rich history. It's very much the history of humans, and we can tell it through foods and drinks. The stories of breads with yeast that break down compounds and produce the gas that rises our loaves, or to alcohol, and these yeasts that kindly remediate this sugar into alcohol. And you can think of brewing as a kind of micro-remediation. We start with this problem, which is we've got too much sugar, and we end with the solution, which is we've got all this alcohol. And then vinegar, you add the extra step. It's like we've got all this alcohol, and then you turn it to vinegar, and so the whole... so micro-remediation in this more modern sense is a generalization of a well-known principle that has powered human life forever. And so there's a huge amount of promise because we've made a terrible mess, and lots of these compounds can be broken down, and some fungi can break down these compounds. But it's not so straightforward as it might always seem, because you can't just... A lot of the time you might test in a lab different fungal strains breaking down different compounds, and they perform perfectly well in ideal conditions in a dish. But throw them into the rumpus of a contaminated ecosystem with all sorts of other beings doing their thing, and the fungus not only has to get a foothold, but then has to really have a chance to work quickly and effectively, and it's not easy to do. But there are promising signs, and thinking more ecologically about it. No, it's not just a fungus on its own can do this, but you might have to think about the fungus as the first step in a process of ecological succession, followed by certain types of plants, followed by other types of plants. So fungi can lead us into thinking more ecologically about our problems, which is one of the wonderful things about them, and this is an example of that.
So we all kind of know that fungi are responsible for like the decomposition and recycling of anything on the planet. We'd be kind of completely overrun with just stuff everywhere, logs and animals, everything. And by breaking that down, they're producing key kind of nutrients for other living organisms. It's back to magic mushrooms again, but I sort of felt that... Do you see a link with how they're working on the human brain, almost recycling kind of negative fallen trees? I don't know, that probably not make much sense, but
I see what you mean.
One of my earliest experiences was just being able to pick out negative thought patterns that had, subconsciously even affected me, and just go, that's not important anymore, just kind of almost drop it out of sight, kind of recycle it, open up something in your brain again. The two things looked almost linked to me, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
I totally see what you mean, and I mean psychedelics open up a space of mental flux and fluidity, and that can be really happy in nudging us out of these rigid habits of thought, habits of thought that add up to depression, that add up to anxiety, and all sorts of other afflictions that we all suffer from to some degree. And so, yes, in some sense, there is a way in which these obstacles, that psychedelics can help us remove obstacles that lie in our lives, that lie before us. And
things that aren't connecting quite right.
Yeah.
It's reconnecting those points or something, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Decomposing the obstacles that we need to decompose, and helping us to make connections that we were failing to make for some reason. So I definitely find this, that the psychedelic states of mind feel very much more organic than my everyday egoic, chatterbox situation. I think that's why these psychedelics have been found to, by these modern studies, to have these remarkable therapeutic qualities. Of course, this is not news for most of the societies who've used these substances for a very, very, very long time.
It's quite a recent thing, isn't it? People are saying that they're covering like 5 or 6 years worth of therapy in kind of one psilocybin session because they feel so encompassed by it. It's allowing so much kind of freeing up of their brain. It's definitely a powerful thing at work, isn't it?
Very much so. And one of the most interesting things about these studies is that they're finding that people who have the most powerful mystical experiences are the people who have the most success kicking their tobacco addiction, for example, or overcoming their depression. And it seems like the mystical experience itself has a therapeutic value. That this sense of connection to something larger, a dissolving of our boundaries, and just a sense of wonder and awe can take people into a place where these problems are alleviated. And so I think that's such a helpful thought, though, that it's not like a drug acting on our bodies. With the brain kind of set aside, bracketed off to the side. Most drugs are tested, against placebo, and placebo is the role of our mind. So you put the placebo effect over here, and you just want to know what the drug does to our bodies without the mind. But in this case, you can't do that because it is the mind, it is the experience that we have in our minds that's the cure. And that's just quite a powerful thought, because then you wonder, well, how much could my mind help me cure these problems when I'm not on psychedelics? And this could be a gateway experience to a whole different way of nourishing ourselves. Yeah, exactly.